Hello and welcome to the Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography podcast in collaboration with the Canadian Society of Echocardiography Journal Club. My name is Dr. Johri, and it is my great pleasure to present today's episode to you. We have a wonderful group of presenters and panelists that we will introduce later on in this episode, and it's our pleasure to present the most recent study from the WASE program that deals with the aorta findings from around the world from the March issue of the Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography. So to kick things off, I'm going to have Dr. Michael Picard introduce this important paper to begin with. Dr. Picard, can you tell us a little bit about this paper?
Sure. Well, let me start by talking a little bit about just the motivation for the WASE studies. We've spoken about some of this on prior podcasts, but it's important to understand what's normal before you can really define what's abnormal. And when we were putting together the 2015 Chamber Quantification Guidelines document, which Dr. Lang chaired, it was very clear when we looked for the normal value data, most of it was from a relatively non-diverse population, mostly Caucasians, populations that had few Blacks or a few Asians and a few Latinos and such. And also typically a middle-aged cohort. And all of these studies were done in the United States and Europe. And there were a few studies from other parts of the world, like in China and Japan, which showed that their normal values were smaller than the European or the US data. So clearly, in order to really understand what's normal around the world, we really needed a better population to study. And that was, I think, the motivation for the WASE study, and that was to really prospectively collect data from around the world, not just in middle age, but really a full age cohort, a racially and ethnic diverse population. And so the two panelists that I'm going to introduce really spearheaded this, proposed and developed the protocol, and then engaged the international echo societies into a research consortium to collect the data. And what they did, what's called the World Association of Societies of Echocardiography, WASE, really was to get a series of groups from around the world, each to enroll 100 patients across a wide distribution of age, and obviously equal, or try to be close to equal sex distribution. And they collected very comprehensive protocol data from a protocol, 2D Doppler, strain, 3D, for really of the entire heart, so that they could really identify what's normal for structure and function for all parts of the heart. And they also integrated new artificial intelligence techniques for some of this. All the measurements were done in a core lab. And not only could we get this entire population, but in many of the publications, we've seen that they've been able to subdivide this into different racial groups and ethnic groups, age groups, look at differences between the two sexes to really establish normal values. So today we're going to look at the aorta, and we've known for a long time that the aortic sizes vary, particularly based on height, but we really don't know much more than that in terms of, is there racial or ethnic differences? And so that's what I think our group is going to talk about today. One comment before I introduce the panelists and pass this along is that in addition to this paper in the March issue, there's also an editorial, and I would encourage people to also take a look at the editorial, because they really did a nice analysis. Matthew Parker did a really nice analysis to look at putting WASE into the perspective of some of the other data that we have on the aorta. And you can really see, I think in a way, sort of validates, when you look at the curves that he generated, it really validates the WASE data. So without any further ado, let me introduce the two principal investigators of the WASE studies. Federico Asch is the director of the core labs at the MedStar and Washington Hospital Center. He, I know, has really done a lot of the grunt work for these studies, and really was able to interact with the investigators from around the world to really get them to produce really great data. And the other panelist is Dr. Roberto Lang, who's the director of the imaging services at the University of Chicago, one of the leaders in 3D echo, and a past president of the American Society of Echocardiography. So I think with that, I will turn it back to you, Amar.
Yes, thanks, Mike. And before I introduce the panelists, I just have a quick question for you. So how many have there been in the series now altogether that have been published in JASE? And is there a way for someone to find all of these articles curated together, or is that something down the road? So
we have, you should have warned me ahead of time so I could have counted them, but we published studies on the LV, both systolic and diastolic function, on the right heart, the left atrium, volume, function. We've got two papers on COVID related to WASE. So we've probably got 7 or 8 papers now that are done, and there's still more coming. So I imagine that at some point, once Roberto and Federico give me the sign that they've really done the primary work, I think as you said, a curated or sort of we'll put these in a binder and figure out a way to distribute a series of these. And you'll also see these, I think, when the next set of guidelines documents come out, talking about normal values for really not only systolic function, but diastolic function in other chambers. I think you'll see the WASE data, as a keystone for all that work.
That's great. I'm very excited about that. So I'd like to introduce our 2 presenters that will be going through the latest WASE studies step by step. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Siew-Li, who is our wonderful sonographer here at Kingston Health Sciences Center. And Siew-Li has actually been on maternity leave. Siew-Li, did you want to tell us anything going on in your life right now?
Thanks, Dr. Johri. Yeah, well, I've just been home for almost, I guess, a year now with my my one daughter, who's almost a year, and then my other 2 have been in and out of school, as we know, with the the restrictions and stuff with symptoms. But we've been having a really great year, and I'm gonna have a good summer with them, and then head back to the lab in September. So I will.
Great, looking forward to having you back. And we have Dr. Usha Manian, who is a non-invasive cardiologist at St. Mary's site in Kitchener-Waterloo, and Usha has been very active with the Canadian Society of Echo, as well as a growing interest and activity with the American Society of Echo. So Usha, tell us what's going on in your part of the world.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here amongst such, major contributors to the echo world. Right now, I'm actually on ward service at our hospital. So I've just taken a quick step away while we're doing this podcast. But I think just as Dr. Picard has alluded to, having normal values is so vital in every part of echocardiogram. It's the workhorse of cardiology, and for us to know how to be able to apply normal values to then abnormal values, I think is so important for us. So I'm really excited to be able to present the work today and get some feedback from the investigators themselves.
Excellent. All right, Siew-Li, we'll let you take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Johri. So I'm happy to be here today with Dr. Manian to present the study to you that looks into the normative values of the aortic root and how different factors such as age, sex, and race has an effect on these values. Just next slide there, please. Perfect. All right, so we know that these values are used to screen for syndromes associated with aortopathies, as well as being used as a guide for surgical recommendations. So I think it's important to shed light on the need to readdress our standards when it comes to looking at the aorta. Studies in recent years have started to do this, but they have been fairly limited studies in terms of their sample size and diversity, and focused on a pretty narrow age range, just as Dr. Picard had mentioned in his introduction. So overall, they've included predominantly white subjects, which isn't representative of the other ethnicities that make up the world population. As well, these studies used values that primarily relied on M-mode measurements. And as we all know, two-dimensional echocardiography has become much better and clearer in the past decade, and we have now moved to a standard where these measurements are completed on a 2D image. So we really do need to have guidelines based on data that is collected and measured in the same way. I think that these previous studies have given us a great jumping off point for us to delve deeper into the roles that age, sex, and racial factors play in determining these normal values, and that's exactly what this study has done. So using data from the WASE study that was just spoken of, the authors looked into establishing normal ranges of aortic dimension across these three factors. They also included values indexed to body size, as we all know this has an association to aorta size. They went even further, trying to eliminate the ability of obesity to skew the results and index to both height and BSA. Just slide change there, please, again. All right, so Dr. Picard already gave us a great overview of the WASE study, but I'll just give a few more brief details about the study because it really is quite impressive. It is a multi-center, international, observational, prospective, and cross-sectional study of healthy individuals that are free from heart, lung, and kidney disease. So their aim was to find a healthy population from which they could derive normal values for echocardiographic quantification. So from September 2016 until January 2019, over 2,000 individuals were screened at 19 centers from 15 countries located on 6 continents. And this just really speaks to the scope of the study and the great collaboration that has been going on. And I think it's just amazing. So getting back to this specific aortic study, they used data from 1,585 individuals and used even amounts of men and women. They broke up their sample population into 3 age categories, with a young range from 18 to 40 years, a middle-aged range from 41 to 65 years, and we'll call it an older range for those above 65 years. They determined racial groups using the framework from the US and UK censuses, as well as the American FDA. They were broken up into white, Black, Asian, and other categories. And now I personally find this a pretty vague classification system, but of course you have to start somewhere, and this does give a good framework to show that there are racial differences and leaves room for further investigation in the future. Participants came in for a single visit where their demographics were taken and comprehensive 2D and 3D echoes were performed. All studies followed the WASE core lab protocols and were analyzed in core labs by board-certified echocardiographers. They specifically looked at the dimensions of the aortic annulus, the sinus of Valsalva, and the sinotubular junction. I'll now briefly go over the standards they use to acquire the images and measure, as there really isn't a point in standardizing these values themselves if we aren't on the same page for acquisition and measuring. They used a parasternal long axis view that optimized and zoomed the area from the LVOT into the ascending aorta. And now, in my many years of working in echo, I know that some people really like a zoom and some people don't, but this is what the guidelines say, and this is how it was done here. The sinus of Valsalva and sinotubular junction were measured at and diastole from leading edge to leading edge, perpendicular to the long axis of the aorta. The aortic annulus was measured in mid-systole from the hinge points between the aortic valve leaflets from inner edge to inner edge. Now, I just want to stress this method of measuring, as we know the guidelines for aortic measuring changed quite a few years ago. Before the change, everything was done inner edge to inner edge. But the new guidelines now state that we measure the sinus of Valsalva, the sinotubular junction, and the ascending aorta from leading edge to leading edge, as it correlates better with MRI measurements. However, just note that the one for the aortic annulus, just like when we measure our LVOT for our continuity equation, still remains inner edge to inner edge. So there's a lovely diagram here on this page of how and where the measurements were performed and how we should be doing it. They then took these measurements and indexed them, like I said before, to both height and BSA for each group of subjects. The results were evaluated using unpaired two-tailed students t-test, which basically means that they looked at the mean and standard deviations of these values in 2 or more unrelated groups of people. The upper limits for these measurements were calculated at the 97.5th percentile for each corresponding age and sex group. Next slide, please. So this table here just lays out the demographics of the study population. You can see the mean age, height, and weight, etc. You can appreciate that they had a very even amount of men and women. And at the bottom, you can see the breakdown of racial diversity. And here it's a little evident that they had lower levels of Black subjects when compared to the white and Asian subjects. However, they did list this as a limitation of the study due to population availability at the participating centers. So there's also room to investigate that more in the future as well. Now to get on to the most interesting part, which is the results. And for that, I will pass you over to Dr. Manian, who will discuss what they found.
Thanks very much, Siew-Li. So this first results table, looking at the aortic measures according to sex, shows that aortic dimensions are larger in men compared to women when adjusted for height. Are larger in men compared to women, and remain so when adjusted for height, but not when adjusted for BSA. And this is quite consistent with the previous results from a number of different studies that have happened across the globe, both within the Asian and European continents. But it gives us a very good starting point to see what we're looking at from a sex perspective, and knowing that men have larger aortic measurements than women. We then moved on to look at the effects of age and sex and alongside the previous studies, we know that the size of the aortic diameters are larger in older individuals. And this is the same across both men and women. And I've just highlighted this here on the results table showing that. And that is with the exception of the aortic annulus. So this is important just to mention that the aortic annulus actually stays the same across all the age groups, but that specifically the sinus of Valsalva and the STJ do become significantly larger in the older population, here labeled as those over the age of 65. And what's important as well is that these age-related differences persisted in both sexes, irrespective of adjustment to both the BSA and to the height. So I recognize there's a lot of numbers on this tape, but the what I've highlighted here, I hope helps you to take away what we're trying to represent. So when looking at the aortic dimensions according to race, which is a really important component that hasn't really been shown in any of the other current guidelines, what we see is that there are significant differences across different races. And although Asians appear to have the smallest absolute values, and I've highlighted that here, both at the annular level, at the sinus of Valsalva level, and at the STA diameter, at the absolute level, they may appear smaller, but when we actually index these to body surface area and to height, and here we've kind of broken it down into sex as well, it's interesting that they actually have the largest indexed dimensions. And so this is where it really highlights the importance that an absolute value has to be taken into consideration with other factors. And here we've highlighted how, or the team has highlighted how race makes a big difference, as well as indexing to body surface area and to height. And what's important about this is that if you do just take the absolute values, the differences could result in under or over diagnosis of aortic dilation, which actually can have real implications for the clinical process that the patients will go through. Moving away from the tabulated formulas, the paper really helps to show that the use of echocardiographic nomograms showing reference intervals for each age groups, and here we've taken it against dependent variable, which is the body surface area, and the next slide will show it against the height, how we can use this tool to estimate whether an aortic dimension falls within the normal range or how far it may diverge from the normal range. And building upon the data from the NOR study, the WASE data really helps to obtain a more diverse population and show that there was a much stronger association with age when height indexing was used rather than body surface area. So this first echocardiographic nomogram shows the values against body surface area. And that, as we've said here, the colored areas represent the normal limits. And when you look to the next slide, which shows the same age group references, but now it's against height indexing rather than against BSA, we see that the values do have a better sort of congruency in this group. And I think what the normograms helped us to show, which may be harder to see from the tabulated results, is that using height indexing may be more beneficial than body surface area. And that's largely, as it's been alluded to, that obesity can really influence BSA, whereas height is more genetically predetermined and is unlikely to change throughout the different stages of adulthood. So a number of us have already sort of spoken about the limitations of the WASE study, specifically the fact that there were a limited number of Black subjects, and this was largely related to the sites that had these individuals had a smaller number. And specifically, we also had a smaller number of individuals who were over the age of 80 years of age, again, meaning that generalizability of all of this normal values in people over 80 or potentially people who do not fall into these race categories may have some difficulties. But I think what the WASE study has really helped us to show is that there is, we now have normal values for a much larger group of people, both in age groups and in race, and then indexed to height and BSA, and that likely current guideline recommendations will have to be adjusted to account for the differences that have really been shown here amongst the data. And I would like to say it's been said already, but I think what Dr. Asch and Dr. Lang have been able to do here is a tremendous effort to put this rich data source out there for us to use globally, which is really fantastic. So with that, I'll end. That is the end of the presentation of the WASE study. I'll just go back to our original slide, just so we have that up. And we'll open the floor now to questions from ourselves and from the audience.
That's great, Dr. Manian. I appreciate that. So just for the audience, please feel free to enter questions into the chat function, and we will moderate those questions. And we'll get started with some questions. I believe, I think our presenters, Siew-Li and Usha, did you want to begin by asking our authors that we have here, that we're lucky to have here, some of the things that may not have been clear when you were presenting this and reading through this presentation, this paper?
Yeah, I'll start. And as again, it's wonderful to have you here, Dr. Lang and Dr. Asch. I suppose the big question when you see all this information is, do you see, how do you see it affecting reports at the reporting level when people are kind of coming across? Do you see us hopefully providing more descriptive data when we're talking about aortic measurements rather than just saying, oh, it's dilated?
I can try. Thank you for presenting. Both of you did a beautiful job at it. I personally think that the next thing to happen is that since the last 2015 chamber quantitation study to now, there have been many studies proposing normal values. And you have the WASE data, you have the Norway data, you have the Australian, there are many also studies of different regions. So I think that the next step will be to put a group of statisticians together and get all these studies and extrapolate this in some sort of way that is similar to all the different parameters. And another thing that you very nicely said is that, how do we index this? And in the case of the aortic root, it becomes clear and it makes sort of sense, sinus of Valsalva, that the taller you are, the bigger your aorta is, and the fatter you are, your aorta remains the same, right? It's sort of logical to get it, and here it showed up. But now in order to do that for real, you need to do that with an outcome. You know, if I do it this way, then this happens, and that's impossible to be done here. You know, there are many different ways of indexing. You can index to the height and then to the allometric power of a certain height to idealize body surface area. So we'll have to come away and to do that. It is also very difficult, you know, when you do these studies, everybody wants you to say, well, what is mild, what is moderate, and what is severely dilated. And if you don't give that, people get like really anxious about it. And from a statistics point of view, you cannot really do it. So I think we have so much more data. And I think that what we understand is that sex makes a big difference, age makes a big difference, and ethnicity, race, I don't know what is the politically correct way to say that, also makes a difference. So it will be very interesting to put a lot of minds together and see how we come up with normal values that make sense. And then if I can, I wanted to say something a little bit different to what Siew-Li said, which is just for it to be clear, you know, if you think about it, the correct way to make a measurement of the sinus of Valsalva would be to make a measurement from inner to inner. That's how you measure a tube, right? But that is the best way. That's how MRI and CT does it. Now, echo still uses this leading edge to leading edge. And the main reason why that continued to be the case is that measurement makes a lot of difference for a lot of surgeries and, you know, patients with Marfan's and so on and so forth. So we decided the chamber quantitation group decided to go and continue to do it, quote unquote, incorrectly from leading edge to leading edge, because we don't have sort of normal values. If we now said that the values change suddenly, then people don't know when you go to surgery and so on. So that is the reason there is still a discrepancy between MRI and CT do it from inner. Echo continues to do it from leading edge to leading edge. And in these studies that you described today, the Waze study, we did it from leading edge to leading edge in end diastole.
That's great.
And going back to the original question, as of how is this going to change our daily practice, I believe was something in those lines that Dr. Manian brought the question. In all honesty, I think this is a step forward. It's not a final answer. I think it is for all of us to realize that there are multiple reasons why we need to adjust and put our measurements in the context. I think we all knew that male and female may have different measurements, although honestly, not everyone is using that. But it's also now highlighting that age is extremely important and your race is extremely important. So it may be that we need to start actually doing this, particularly in centers where we have a really global population. But if you lead an echo lab in South Korea, where most of the patients are going to be similar to the subpopulation of Asians that is described here, maybe you use mainly those numbers. Or if you have an echo lab in I don't know, in Kenya, to say something, you may have to use the population for Black people. And I think that is important. And then each of us in our labs, in our own clinical settings, will determine which is the right measurement that we should be using. Hopefully, this is going to be taken eventually a step forward, and this could be embedded into our echo machines. And when you, at the beginning of the exam, you enter the age of the patient and the date of birth, you may be able to enter the race of the patient, and with that, then automatically start selecting the proper normal values for this and that. Of course, that is futuristic thinking, but why not? That maybe is something more leading towards personalized medicine in a way.
You took the words right out. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking we should just have another little cut point for the ethnicity to go into there.
Thank you, Federico and Roberto and Usha. Siew-Li, did you have a question for the authors as well? And then we can go to the audience. From a sonographer's perspective, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I was actually kind of just looking at some of the questions showing up in the chat, and we actually had one that was similar. Someone here, Kareem, asked, why did they not look at the ascending aorta? And that was also one of our questions we had. Is this something that we're going to see in another study coming, or was there a reason that you think maybe they left it out?
We did not measure the ascending aorta because we did not really request that type of acquisition. And part of the issue, even you probably know this better than I, is that when as a sonographer you're measuring the ascending aorta and you're trying to compare, this measurement varies according to exactly the site. And therefore we make usually, at least in my echo lab, we say the ascending aorta was measured X so many centimeters from the aortic root, and that varies. So it would have been very difficult to obtain a measurement that was sort of uniform across the board. So that is the reason why we didn't do it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we did not include it in the acquisition protocol. So that variability would have become really significant.
And I agree with what you said, because even if you say, let's do this ascending aorta measurement for everyone 1.5 centimeters from the STJ or something like that, you could be normal there, and we see it then get quite dilated after that. So you can't really lump everyone into a single measurement. So that makes complete sense. But
and sort of taking the chat box a bit further here, guys, again, some similar questions that we also had for it. How do you measure asymmetry of the sinus of Valsalva? So sometimes you have a dilated sinus, or it's not the uniform bulbular kind of formation. How would you, I don't know, how do you, we're trying to say normal here, and I suppose I'm talking about variance within normal.
So, well, I think that is a great question. Not that we can answer that from the data we have collected in the study, but I think it's a very fair and important question. So my opinion would be, and again, it's not based on the WASE data, but it's just an echocardiographer opinion, is that you need to understand that at that point you're dealing with a three-dimensional structure in which dimensions could be very different depending on which angle you take and what kind of ultrasound axis you actually collect on the image. So either you do it through a 3D image that you can cut and select the measurement you want to make, or you have to make an attempt to get a good short axis at the aortic root, which frequently is going to be an oblique view. So you have to be very careful with those measurements, but I think it will give you a better idea of the different three, if you will, diameters you could take for each of the three sinuses. Normally what we do is we go from one commissure to the opposite sinus, making the measurement the biggest possible. To be honest with you, that's a measurement we learned doing more from the CT world, and we can adapt easily to 2D echo, but mostly to 3D echo.
Thank you, Dr. Asch. I want to just jump in with a question as well. I'm interested in your other category. And in some countries, including the Kansas countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US, we have a Aboriginal or Indigenous population. And historically, that population has not been, their health has not been well addressed, especially here in Canada, and we're trying to do a better job with that. So I'm curious, have we been able to look at including those populations in any of the WASE studies yet?
No, that is a great question, and we grappled with that exactly, and our other sort of, the other for us, think about other, like let's say Argentina is a country that has also native people, if not people are from, let's say, Italy and Spain, and Brazil has a country that also has a different, Mexico is the same thing, Canada is the same thing. So we actually separated according to from where the patients came, and we created this very loose category of other. And that's something that definitely there is some time to do a better job at it. But in our category, if I don't remember bad, Federico, it was, I think, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. I don't think we separated Canada.
Yeah. Now, it was almost exclusively Mexico, but there were a few from Brazil, a few from Argentina. And the reason why other fell, it's actually other/mixed, if you will. And Mexicans, really, they consider themselves a mix of Native Americans and white people. And they self-identify as that, their physicians identify them as that. So I can tell you that if you look at the data coming from that other group or mixed group, and you look at data coming from Mexico by itself, it's almost the same, because there's just a few extra mixed race individuals from around the world. But it's an amazing question. I mean, it really speaks. First of all, could we ever have developed or designed a study that would take care of ethnicities? It's impossible, right? It is just impossible. You're describing Canada or the US or Australia. Well, I can tell you, in India, we had two centers, and purposefully, one was from the north, one was from the south, really in trying to get an attempt at kind of separate those ethnic groups. Now, India has hundreds of different ethnicities, right? Can we address that in this study? Certainly not. So it is an amazing opening, if you will. I think we were not that, what's the right word? Our hopes were not to describe ethnicities all over the place. And we realized that early. At the beginning, we said, oh, we're going to talk about ethnicities. And then we kind of dropped the concept of ethnicity out of our own analysis because it was too ambitious. That's the word. It was too ambitious. And we really cannot do that. Now, what we did trigger was the interest for others that actually work and live in countries with very different ethnicities to actually start exploring this. And I can tell you, India wants to do an analysis separating different ethnic groups. Both Roberto and I have been invited to participate as on a steering group for a study in the UK that is really going to be throughout the UK and look at different ethnic groups. I just heard yesterday, and Roberto may not have heard about this, but Roberto, you will be invited soon. Brazil is starting a WASE study in Brazil. And they actually want to reproduce everything we did, but just in Brazil, because they have so many different groups. Argentina, I have participated, and I was kind of supervising some work they have done also, describing different ethnic groups. So we kind of planted the seed, and hopefully others can take it from there and make it work. for both Roberto and I, this is like seeing our child grow. And I know that I can speak for him. It actually really fills our hearts when we see that.
It's really fascinating because especially for multi-ethnic societies like ours, and it makes an impact on day-to-day practice in terms of who we're sending to surgery, for example, and who we're deciding not to. And we may not have the answer yet, but it's telling us that we need to pay attention to other factors in our patients. So I think that's what I'm really taking out of this. And it has real day-to-day implications in Canada and the US, which are multi-ethnic societies. So I'm going to... Can
I say two little very brief things? One is in keeping with what Federico said is, I don't think the WASE study is good enough to obtain normal values for different ethnic groups. The only thing that this study did is exactly what Federico said, is to sparkle and show that this exists. And then everybody would have to take that into consideration. Another thing that I think is fascinating to me is, just to take an example, Usha, you are coming from, I don't know if you are the first. I'm an immigrant from South America, but you're an immigrant
from India.
Or you are an immigrant from India, or your parents are?
My parents are. I'm second generation.
So let's see I'm sure your aorta is very small just by looking at you.
Yes.
What happens with 3 generations of your people living in Canada and eating the bad food and so on. So how does that change in ethnicity? No, that is something that I always was very, very interesting, because things have changed, right? Even India, I have been going many times there, and the body habitus of many Indian people are changing with a bad food habit. So I'm sure that will also have eventually an impact, right?
100%. And then just to throw it even more, the mixed cultures, my brother-in-law is English and my sister is Indian, and then my nieces and nephews, how do you, and I think that's exactly what you said, guys. I was so, as an echocardiographer and doing this all the time, what you have interested is that you've exactly said it. One size can certainly not fit everybody, and we have to pay attention. And I think that's exactly as Dr. Johri and Dr. Asch and Dr. Lang, you've said, that you have to pay more attention to the information in front of you. And I think I think that we will all hopefully take a bit more attention from here.
I have another comment, and then I'm going to get my colleague, Dr. Tsang, who has joined us, Michael Tsang, who helped organize this session as well, to provide any questions or comments. One question I had was, though, you showed differences between men and women. So there are structural differences. Men and women are definitely different. I'm curious whether those differences persisted within all ethnic groups. Like you showed the differences overall, I believe, but were there groups in which sex made less of a impact, or was that sort of a common finding no matter what the ethnicity?
I'm not sure we looked at that level of, the comparison of one to the other. I think it was quite uniform, to be honest with you. I think it was happening in all ethnic groups, but you need to understand, though, that the number of, once you start breaking a population into so many groups and subgroups and subgroups, the number on each of these groups you end up comparing is much smaller. So the power of your comparisons is also smaller. So I would just bring that caveat. But okay. I think in general, we did not identify that this was so different among the different race groups.
Okay. Dr. Tsang, would you like to make a comment or question?
Hi, can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. A great presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the panel's insights as well. It's definitely a very important study, and completely agree with all the comments made already. I think I'm just looking at all the questions in the chat box as well. Historically, I think there's one question being posted asking whether we should focus more on indexing all the measurements to BSA or to height. I think historically in echo, I think we've always been doing the indexing to body surface area. So should there be a difference, or is there any preference towards whether indexing to BSA or indexing to height or any other parameters would be more preferable?
You know, when we send these papers to JASE, reviewers have to say something. So it's easy to say, why don't you index to 1 trillion things, right? Because that, of course, creates a lot of work for us. But my opinion is that for most of the things, body surface, but you have to understand, this is a normal population. There were not many people that were extremely deviant, right? Or extremely obese, or there were no basketball players here or whatever. So, you know, when you take this population, for everything, body surface area seems to work very well. Here, as Usha very nicely pointed out, and she made that point exactly on the nomograms, is that height for the aorta seems to be better than body surface area.
Yeah, and we are, by the way, we're doing some analysis on the left atrium in this area as well, and it also seems to work better. And this is something that it has been said now, but it was not during the presentation. Please remember, let's take the data for what it is. In this study, there were not obese people. The part of the inclusion criteria was the body based on the body mass index. So we avoided having people that were extremely thin and people that were on the obese range. So I think we need to take it for what it is and put it in the right context. I would think that once you start including more and more obese people, actually the difference between height indexing and body surface area indexing is going to become more and more prominent, and probably is going to show much easier that height is the right way to do it. Part of the work that I've been doing with the Argentina group that I mentioned before is actually on those lines. And they actually show very nicely that as soon as you start deviating from the ideal body weight on both ends, actually the discrepancy is much, much larger. And that's where clearly having a height index kind of makes the population more homogeneous, if you will, and makes a lot of sense, but we don't do it. so hopefully we're bringing some light into it.
And also this indexation to height is more complicated than that, because there is a indexation to height, which is called an allometric, that you elevate the height to a certain power, and there are certain powers, and this becomes very, very complicated. So we'll have to learn more about this.
Okay, great. So we do have a few other questions in the chat that I think we've answered most of them. There are some questions regarding pathology and extremes. And I just want, as Dr. Asch mentioned, we don't have the data regarding that. So it's not dealing with, significantly obese patients or congenital patients, for example, Turner syndrome. So I just wanted to mention that. Dr. El-Mufla, are you asking a question? Did you have a quick question as well? And then we'll move to the last part of our episode. Yep.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Johri and Usha and Siew-Li. I really enjoyed your talk. Congratulations to Dr. Lang and Asch for such a great project. This is almost revolutionary, because we're always focused about this minor pathology, and you take the big picture and you're like, well, let's first define what is normal, and then we can start talking about pathology. My question to both of you is, similar to when the World Health Organization changed the BMI cutoff in 1998 from 27 for women, 28 for men to 25. And overnight, millions of people have now been considered overweight. Do you anticipate the same issue to come up, especially considering that there will be variance in how quick laboratories will adapt this guideline? So this, in theory, the same patient can have the same echo in two labs and told, you're abnormal or you're normal. That's my first question. The second question is, this is a very important work to identify the normal, but it doesn't tell us about the cutoffs for intervention, because all the interventions have been done through cutoffs that were unfortunately based on, male, mostly white patient population, but these are the cutoffs that we have nonetheless. So how do you navigate these two concerns?
Roberto, you pick one and I'll take the other one.
Yeah, I'll take the one that I know how to answer. So I think I know. So what you're asking is a very good question. The problem is that to answer a little bit this question, you have to do different studies, because if I want to know what left atrial volume will portend to have a atrial fibrillation, this is a different study than to do normal values, right? So if you want to show a certain apnea, so all of these studies, you need to do it with an outcome of something, and we don't have that. So the only thing we can say is I took 2,000 people and this is the average and this is how they deviate. And then you decide what is big and you put it whatever adjective you want. They say that the best echo labs have the most amount of adjectives for things. Mild, mild to moderate, moderate to this. If you have like 8 adjectives, then you're really good echo lab. But we cannot tell you that, and so that will require another study. We all, I think, as a group should understand, for example, Usha mentioned these nomograms. I looked into these nomograms with a lot of detail, and they were written by Devereaux and his group in Cornell many years ago. And they were based on 30 to 40 patients with M-mode. And that's what we all used in order to this. So, you have to, the chamber quantification of 2015 that thousands of people quote, if you knew that the left ventricular volumes were established for maybe 400 people that were mostly white, so what do they really mean? So I don't know, we have to, I think we are all getting better at asking questions, but I don't think we can answer your question as to when to do an intervention with this data, not even close.
Okay, so I think I'm going to start wrapping up. Thanks everyone for your questions and your comments. I think I really want to move to the STEAM portion of our segment where we try to introduce some art and humanities to our science topics. So this is where I've asked Siew-Li to tell me about some art that inspires her that she can share with our audience as we wrap up.
Thanks, Dr. Johri. I think it's coming up here. I don't know if the art necessarily inspires me, but I thought this was a nice piece to share because it's actually a piece of art that I recently purchased. If you read my little bio in the email, I spent about almost 10 years out in Calgary, and this is from a local artist in the small town that I lived in. And these mountains here are called the Three Sisters. So this is painting called the Three Sisters, which is very fitting for our family because we have 3 daughters. So it's special to us in that way. And that is done by local artists, from the place where we used to live for 10 years. So it's hanging in our house now and it's very special to us.
That's wonderful, Siew-Li. I think it has some personal connection to you. And I do remember seeing the three sisters in person as well. It's a breathtaking part of the world. So thanks for sharing that. And I think it's quite apt. We've been talking about different parts of the world, and the WASE study looks at findings from echo around the world and brings it all together so we can discuss it. And I think I would recommend that all of you download this paper in the March issue of the Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography. The WASE has been a wonderful multi-country collaboration. And in the same spirit, I'm very grateful for this collaboration between the Canadian Society of Echocardiography and the Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography podcast to come together and discuss this paper. So thank you so much, Dr. Lang. Thank you so much, Dr. Asch, Dr. Manian, and Siew-Li. You guys were wonderful for this presentation. And I'm going to end there and ask you to sign up for ASE, which is coming up in June 10th to 14th, and keep an eye out for future JASE CSE collaborations and podcasts. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to present today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.